Welcome to Through a Therapist's Eyes with Chris Gazdick.
The host and co-host Craig Graves to another edition where we invite you to see the world through the lens of a real mental health and substance abuse therapist. The goal, do you know, Craig, is to?
You know what? You put me on the spot and I'm drawing a blank, man.
That's awesome. Through the medium of this podcast, we're trying to create emotional growth, being aware it's not a delivery of therapy services in any way. We need to highlight the email. You can email, I think I could say me directly or Craig directly. I can forward it to him. But I get the email direct at contact@throughatherapiststyles.com. That's a direct way to interact with me. I want to highlight that a little bit more. And I also want to highlight our donation button.
Yep.
You know, we need to highlight that a little bit. We really want to get a camera for YouTube videos that we kind of have some ideas about. We need support for the show. You find the button on Craig. I gave us $1 just to test it out. Did I tell you that?
You did.
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
I gave us $1. It's as simple as $1. But honestly, guys, if 100 people offer $1, man, that buys us a camera that we can use or something like that. Really, I mean, it's going to help the show.
Yeah, it does.
Help
every little
us.
bit helps, and every little bit adds up. Yeah, it does.
You want to give us $5,000 for the month? That'd be fantastic. Also, I gotta say,
Yeah, I wouldn't get greedy, buddy.
Craig, this is the human emotional experience. Let's figure this thing out together.
Let's do it.
All right. We're going to highlight Metrolina Psychotherapy Associates. 704-461-8253 is our sponsoring agency, serving children, adolescents, and adults in Belmont, North Carolina since July 1, 2010. And a birthday's coming up for these guys here in a minute, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's right. It is
Yeah.
almost a birthday and
Yeah.
anniversary. As a matter of fact, I'm trying to think when this show will go out.
Yeah, it's going to be a few weeks, a couple weeks.
Yeah, we might miss it by a day or two.
That's true. Good point for that. We record and a little bit in advance. We got another guy to highlight. Matthew Hanks Realty.com, right?
Yeah, Matthew Hanks is our new sponsor.
Who are those guys?
It's a local real estate agent here in our local area. Matthew's been a friend of mine for a long time and a friend of Chris's now for almost 2 years. He's a great guy, got a great team. And if you're in the area and need real estate services, Matthew Hanks' team, that's the only way I'd go.
Matthew at hanksrealitygroup.com.
Realty.
You guys were busting my chops not too long ago. What is their contact information, Mr. Craig Graves?
Matthew at hanksrealty.com. Realtygroup.com. Jeez.
Now I'm messing with you.
Good grief. Well, it's because you got some kind of hack in there. If you guys can see this paper, then you'd understand. Matthew at hanksrealitygroup.com.
hanksrealitygroup.com for their website, man. They do a good job with realty property selling and buying. They're awesome over there. Matthew, we love you, brother. What are we doing tonight? We have an awesome guest that we pre-recorded. So Miss Gwen Wild, and you're going to get her introduction here in a second. We just recorded it, and now we're doing the pre-intro to the show.
It's a great show. I think you guys are going to like it.
This is awesome.
Part 2, we broke it into two parts. So we haven't recorded part 2 yet, but Gwen's coming back to record part 2 with us, and I'm really excited about part 2.
Let's run it.
Yep.
So we have, as we did in our introduction, Craig, Miss Gwen Wild, who is with us. Check this out. See how I could do with this introduction. See what you think. She is an experienced occupational therapist specializing in the treatment of children and adolescents diagnosed with autism and sensory processing disorders. She's the owner of something called Sensational Brain LLC and the creator. Have you ever heard of BrainWorks?
I don't think I have.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest with you, man. In my field, I heard about it. And before I went to this conference is where I met her. I heard BrainWorks, heard of it. And I was like, oh my gosh, I realized in mid-conference that I'm like sitting in front of this woman who created BrainWorks,
I remember
man.
you
It's
telling me
amazing.
about it after the conference because you were pretty excited
I
about
was.
the conference. Yeah.
I was. It's, the owner of Sensational Brain LLC, and she presents to audiences nationwide on topics related to sensory modulation, self-regulation. She lives in Galesburg, Michigan, with her husband and 3 teenage daughters. 3 daughters is a challenge. Gwen, welcome to Through a Therapist's Eyes. How'd I do with that intro?
Thank you, Chris. That was great.
Yeah, you have done a lot.
Well, it sounds good on paper anyway.
Absolutely. Don't kid yourself. The stuff that I came across, and I talk about conferences on this show, man, and Craig's heard me kind of poo-poo them when we began thinking, oh man, I kind of get, a little bored in them, and I don't know, you hear some of the same things, and man, I have run on an amazing streak of conferences, and I got to say, your talk, I mean, I was locked on the whole time. There was no doubt about it.
Well, great. Thank you. I enjoy it. I love talking about the neurotransmitters specifically, and self-regulation is just such a huge topic right now. So that's my favorite one to give.
Absolutely. How many different do you give? I think online you have, we'll point our audience, because we have a lot of therapists that listen,
Okay, great.
do CEUs and all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, online we offer CEUs mainly for occupational therapists and speech therapists. I'm looking into being able to provide CEUs for mental health practitioners also. But for live courses in person, like the one you attended, I do the self-regulation course. And then I have one called Sensory and Behavior. And that we look at a holistic view on treating the issues that are often seen in kids with autism in particular, that are a little bit sensory, but also a little bit behavioral in nature. And then I have one called Creating Effective Sensory Diets, where we really focus in depth on the sensory processing piece and how to go about meeting those needs. And then for the short webinars, we have a big variety of topics. My specialty is the sensory thing, but we have other speakers who present on everything from primitive reflexes to yoga. So big variety on there.
Well, I got to tell you, we've been able to develop a listening audience around, I think almost most states. I don't know what's up with the people in Dakota, man, North and South Dakota, Craig. Well, you need to market those folks. We have exactly 0 downloads in those states, I believe.
Really?
But yeah, man, they can find you online and get their trainings and stuff. I think you'll, hopefully they'll find it, because I would say your training was absolutely, like I said, just riveting. Really,
Great.
really
well. Thank you. Riveting's good.
Riveting to say the least. Tell us about occupational therapy, because one of the things I thought was cool when we were connecting during the breaks and stuff, our fields, I guess, are different, right?
Yeah.
Mental health and substance abuse. I have an LCSW. Everyone's got all their letters. Oh, I didn't say that, by the way. MOT, OT/L.
Yep.
What is occupational therapy, and what do all those letters mean?
Well, a Master of Occupational Therapy is MOT. And then occupational therapist registered and licensed. In most states, we're required to be licensed also. So that's what those stand for.
It's funny, because somebody asked me that. They're like, what's an LCSW? And at the time I had an ATOD. I'm going to give you $100 right now if you know what ATOD stands for.
ATOD. Assistive Tech. I don't know.
Alcohol, tobacco, and other drug. That is a certification that I held, and I dropped it because I didn't want to give
Physical.
2 bills anymore for it.
That's good.
The letters are important, but they mean that we've done a lot of training and studying, right?
Right. Yep. Occupational therapy, we do, in our training, we have about 50% that's focused on physical rehab and physical abilities, kinesiology, all of that. And then the other half is a psychological background. And really, OTs got their start in the psych area during one of the wars. I think it was World War I. And so we have that as our background. And then historically, it kind of evolved over the years to where we became known as the fine motor experts. And when I started practicing OT way back in 1995, we mainly did see kids with physical disabilities like cerebral palsy. We were doing a lot of fine motor skill development. And then we've really just seen a shift beginning probably 15 years ago to where through our role in sensory processing, we began seeing kids with what we're now calling self-regulation issues.
Right.
15 years ago, we were still referring to them more in the behavioral realm, and seeing how kids on the spectrum and kids with ADHD are impacted by sensory issues that cause self-regulation issues. And now it's just grown from there to where we are using this bottoms-up approach to address self-regulation by recognizing the role of balancing neurotransmitters and then making sure the sensory needs are met. So where the mental health field starts more at a higher level, we're starting at that brain-based level that we're finding works well in conjunction, because once we get the lower levels of the brain working well, then it frees up the higher levels of the brain to do the work that you all are more accustomed to doing. So it's a good combination, and I do refer back and forth with mental health practitioners in our area because we see that there's a need for both to address lots of the same issues, trauma, chronic stress, and so it works well hand in hand. And there's one piece of it that's a little bit more mine and a piece of it that's a little bit more in the mental health field. But we can certainly all do some of the basics and see best practice results that way.
Absolutely. You know, Craig, we're just getting warmed up, but I think this lady is going to blow your head off when we start talking about the brain and neurology and everything.
I don't know,
It
that's
is
pretty high.
absolutely amazing. What would do you have a thought, Craig? Do you look like you had a thought?
Well, I just, maybe I'm just not, maybe I missed it, but occupational therapy, just kind of in a nutshell. I think I missed the definition of that.
Sure. In a nutshell, we focus on the occupations of life. So work, play, and self-care. Anything that affects those areas fall under our domain. And so when we're thinking about things like self-regulation skills and the ability to control your emotions and behavior, we're looking specifically at how that impacts a person's ability to work, play, and take care of themselves. So we're looking at it from a very practical standpoint. How can we get them to succeed in their daily occupations successfully? So, for example, in my role with kids, I just saw a kid today that she's been to a psychologist, she's been through play therapy, and has yet to really experience success. But her big issue is that she wore one outfit to school all year, and it was a swimming suit cover-up, and not appropriate in Michigan, but it was the only thing she could tolerate. And then it fell apart in April. It literally became unwearable in April. They tried to keep it together as long as they could. And then she had about 2 months that it was getting her out the door, kicking and screaming, dragging her in, where she would sit in the principal's office all day because she was in a sports bra and underwear, and you can't go to school like that. And so the parents wanted her to at least be in the building, and it's tough. And so she finally ended up finding another outfit that she will tolerate. But it's odd and it's not replaceable because there are things she found in the depths of her mom's closet. So they're nothing you could go out and buy again today. And it's not really summer appropriate. And she's going to a summer camp soon. And so we're trying to get her to focus on how to deal with things like that. And at the heart of it, I think it's a combination of probably generalized anxiety disorder,
Right.
It's causing her to kind of be living in some state of fight or flight. And the way that she's trying to get some control in her life is by dictating what she'll wear and won't wear. And then there's a little bit of a sensory piece for sure too. She's very picky about how her clothing feels, and she doesn't want people touching her through certain clothing. She doesn't really like people touching her anyway, but it's the way that it feels she'd rather you touch her skin than touch the clothing. So it's an odd set of symptoms. She's bright, she's funny, she's cute. Nothing, you just look at her and you think, how can she not tolerate that? And she's missed birthday parties and missed out on fun stuff. So as an occupational therapist, that's what I'm focusing on, is how can we get you to go to camp? How can we get you clothing that will allow you to participate? And how can we get you to school? How can we enable you to be able to go to birthday parties successfully wearing birthday appropriate clothing? She's in third grade. She can't show up in a sports bra and underwear, So
Right.
we're just looking at it from a practical standpoint. So I spend time with her. Today we talked about how fashion expresses our personalities, and helped her choose some fashions that would show her personality. And then after we did some calming activities, we used this therapeutic brushing protocol that we use that kind of desensitizes the tactile receptors. And then she changed into an outfit that she selected. And while she was in it, we did yoga. We went on a jog to help her learn that once she gets busy, she can put the thoughts of how the clothing feels out of her mind. And she successfully stayed in an appropriate outfit for about 45 minutes. So
Nice.
Working toward, our goal is to have 3 outfits that she can tolerate for camp in a month.
I got you. Okay.
Yeah. So we're kind of just the practical piece of how can we get you to survive in the environments that are important for you.
Got it.
So as an OT, I do less of diving into the history, like you may as a mental health practitioner, of what really got her to that point, what's the history behind what's causing her to be that way. And I'm just kind of more focused on the here and now, and what can we do right now.
Got it. I guess I would think about an occupational therapist as an occupation, like a job, but you're saying it's a student or a child or a
Right.
person, whatever. It
It's whatever
spans
their
the whole
life
gamut.
occupations are. And for
Got it.
kids,
Got it.
you
And if you don't mind, can you define self-regulation?
Oh, we'll get there. Let's put a pause on that one. We're definitely
Okay.
going to spend some
All right.
time on that for
Got it.
sure. But
Okay.
I mean, it's funny, Gwen. Thank you for that, because I hate to do this, but I'm pretty genuine on our show, man. I have to admit, I have never made I think it's true to say. Now I have to put it this way. I think it's true to say that I have never made a direct referral to an occupational therapist as a mental health therapist. And I hate to say that, because like we were talking about, as we were talking about, at the conference, well, I started this, what is OT thing, right? Because I think therapists really need to know. And so my question is when would we refer to an OT person? How and for what kind of issues? And I don't think a lot of our fields really kind of, blend together and coordinate so well, frankly.
Right. In a lot of settings, we don't. I just happen to have gotten to know a few in my area, and we do well together in that regard. But the times when you guys might think about referring to us are when you're hearing that there are some issues that don't seem to be based on history or family relationships or trauma, and still you're hearing about a lot of issues that have to do with oversensitivities or certain forms of input that they're craving that seem odd, or if you're hearing about kids who have very limited diets, very difficult to potty train. Those are the kinds of issues that we can look at both through the lenses of what's going on in their brains, as well as the physiological factors that can contribute to some of those issues. So if you're looking at a kid and you think, I can't really explain this based on history or what they've been through, and yet there are some pretty significant issues, that's when we might want to think about the variables that we often deal with in OT.
Yeah, and see, to me in the therapy world, I think that it's a common understanding. Maybe it's not. I mean, years and years ago, I come across working with sensory processing disorders. I mean, you're talking all about sensory processing, and it's all about tactile, taste, all the senses. So for sensory processing is like things that, like Craig, when you have a sensory processing issue, you might hear a normal sound like a car driving, but if I have sensory processing disorders, particularly with my hearing, I'm going to hear nails on a chalkboard when a car drives by. Like I cannot tolerate it, right? So It's those sensory processing issues that OT works really, really well with. Is that a true statement?
Yep, that's a true statement. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How'd you get into it?
Well, one of my early jobs was at this phenomenal place in Wichita, Kansas. That's a residential educational program for kids, primarily with severe autism. And then we also had an outpatient clinic there. And I was way in over my head at that point. I was young, I was dumb, I didn't know what I was doing. And we had complex kids, but I had a good therapist there who I learned a lot from. And that was kind of our specialty. And that was in the late 90s, where we were really just starting to become known for dealing with sensory processing issues. And at the same time, that's when we really started to see the incidence of autism increasing rapidly. And everybody was scrambling to figure out, how are we going to treat this? And so I was working there. And then, interestingly, our first daughter was born, and she came out screaming and really didn't stop for about 10 months. And definitely had sensory issues. She was very over responsive, had feeding issues. Didn't really want to be messed with. And so that made me dive in differently in looking at it as my own child, and how to work around some of those things that you can't open up a parenting book and figure out how to address,
Oh, they don't address that one in the NICU?
No. So that made me more interested in figuring out how to help these parents. These parents, they're looking at the kids who have very limited diets, and they feel like failures, because if you can't get your kids to eat, like, how am I going to get them healthy, and how are we going to get them to grow? And, before I had kids, I was pretty judgmental about people who let their kids eat chicken nuggets and French fries 3 times a day. And then you have a kid like that and you think, I get it.
Yep.
You want them to survive and you want them to grow. And so you give in on things that you never would have thought you would have given in on, for the sake of some sanity. And because those kids they would rather starve to death sometimes than eat some things that you want to put in front of them.
Hey, it gets real when you have kids, doesn't it?
It's real. It's very
real.
Yes. So, and I just really had an interest in that. In fact, I can look back to my own childhood and think I had sensory issues, and so I think that also has made me interested. I remember I've always been a people pleaser, so I was an obedient kid, but I had a lot of clothing issues myself, and that was back in the bobby sock days where you would fold them down a couple of times, and they never hit on my ankles at exactly the right. And it literally made me nauseous,
You remember, Craig, when you rolled up your jeans and quartered them off?
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, those kind of things.
Yeah.
You guys were probably well adjusted in that way, and it didn't bother you, but it bothered me, and I knew it was weird, and I cried. I made my mom cry.
Yeah.
So I knew it was odd, but I didn't quite know what to do about it. And so, looking back, I can see I have a lot of sensitivities, and I still get overstimulated easily, and in malls and things like that. But for the most part, I found ways to cope and adapt, as most people do. But I think it gives me a little bit more understanding for these kids that I get it,
Well, I think that's interesting, Gwen, because I have a little bit of a personal theory that with most emotional issues, you talk about generalized anxiety disorder or trauma. Craig, we've talked about trauma responses. I think there's a lot of reactions or experiences, better word. There's a lot of experiences that people have that are pretty universal. And I do happen to believe that sensory experiences is one of them that, as you say, people will learn kind of how to cope with. Mm-hmm. And if we really think about it, I think almost universally people can think of things that bothered them. Like one that still bothers me, and I have sensory issues. Like when I was a kid, man, to get me to shower was a nightmare. And you know why? Because when I get out of the shower, I'm cold. I cannot stand that. That's our fun fact of the show, Craig. When I got out of showers.
We would say that you're over-responsive to interoceptive input.
Oh my God, say that again.
Over-responsive to interoceptive input.
I told you, she's going to make your mind blow, Craig. Interoceptive input. But my point is,
our idea of what's going on in our body. That's what interoception is. So hot or cold, thirsty, hungry, all of that. So
yeah, and my point is that I think that people experience those types of things and kind of get freaked out. But it's pretty normal. The trouble is when it really begins to be disruptive. Like if I was a teenager and still not showering, that'd be a problem.
Exactly.
Right?
Mm-hmm. A lot of us have, it's a continuum. Sensory modulation is on a continuum. So we all can find little things. My husband hates to hear people crunch, things like that. Most of us have something. But as long as we find ways to cope and adapt, then it's not a disorder. It becomes a disorder when it disrupts life and the kids can't figure out what they need to do about it, how to do things differently. That's when it becomes a disorder.
And that's what OT really gets to deal with.
Yep.
Okay. So for the listening audience, and Craig, just so you know, I do take showers.
Good. I hope so.
Often.
I hope so.
Like
How many clients if you didn't?
Every day, man. Actually, every day.
Good for you. Good for you. So
great. Gwen, one of the things that I really thought was cool when we chatted that I wanted to definitely spend a minute on, is I'm really passionate about mental health, and I'm passionate about, therapy services. And I really kind of have full intentions of doing some in-services in the future and whatnot on what makes it work. Right. And I remember talking to you, and it was actually the first thing that made me say, oh man, it'd be really cool to get her on the show. I wonder if she would. And you'll probably never guess what it was, but as you were talking and presenting, you had mentioned that you really believe that when you're working with, particularly kids, at the time I think you were talking about teenagers, that they want information. Like that you believe in a teaching model when you're working with people. And I really have followed that up. And prior to you saying that, for the last year or two, as I've been really thinking about that particular question, what makes therapy work? That I feel like is one of the things that I've really landed on. Can you mention what you meant by that? And do you remember saying that?
Yeah, I think I do. I just get very scientific with the kids. And I feel like they buy in more. Like today, I was working with this 9-year-old, but she's bright. And so I was talking to her about if we want to become a good musician, we practice. If you want to be a pianist, you practice the piano day after day after day. And I talked to her about, if we want to be good at keeping our brains and our bodies calm, we have to practice keeping our brains and our bodies calm. And so I was talking to her about in relationship to yoga and using some mindfulness apps like Smiling Minds. And so I just got out a piece of paper and I drew a picture of the axon and the dendrite. And then I showed her that the more often we practice calming, the stronger we're building those connections that facilitate calming in the brain. And then I drew the little myelin sheath on the axon.
Yeah.
That helps it become, it's like insulation so that these calming messages travel more efficiently. And, she was kind of nodding. She got it. Kids like it when you talk to them scientifically rather than talking down to them. And I could really see her mom and her grandma were sitting right there too. And they were like, oh, and I could see them buy-in, asking them to let her listen to the Smiling Minds meditation app every day. They're like, yeah, why? But once you make it scientific, then they understand and then you get buy-in. And with a lot of the teenagers, that I work with, I just take the time to talk to them about the neurochemicals and talk to them about, rather than just recommending that they exercise every day, I talk to them about when you exercise, it increases dopamine, which feels good, serotonin, which makes you happier, epinephrine, which is a stress reliever. And then we start getting more buy-in because they know what it's doing in their brains. And we talk to them about, how do you feel before you exercise? How do you feel during? How do you feel after? So that it becomes more of a conscious awareness of that difference. And once you start being mindful of the fact of how much better you feel after you exercise and how much easier it is to focus, then it becomes easier to make yourself do it again the next day.
And that's and what I hear you saying, yeah, that's awesome, is a buy-in. The thing for therapists that are listening that I've kind of, and I just heard you talking about it, man. People, in order to get well, need to really buy in to what you're doing, right? And I don't know if you've thought much about that, but I think that's a big piece of what helps us work with people.
It is, Chris. And our last research study, we implemented a program in a school that involved brain breaks and sensory breaks and the use of sensory strategies as needed throughout the day. And we can show in our data that the teachers who spent the most time teaching the why behind the use of movement in the classroom, their kids did better than who had access to the exact same strategies but weren't taught the why, or the teachers hadn't spent as much time teaching the why. So there's something magical about understanding why it works. And maybe it's the kids threw themselves into it more effectively. I don't know, but it matters.
It's insight, having some insight, like an insight model, essentially.
Yeah.
I mean, Craig, I tell you, man, did you know you had a myelin sheath? Is that what she said? Myelin sheath in the brain with the dendriums?
Oh, I didn't know that. That's new to me.
It's essentially the white matter in the brains. And the more of that, the more efficient our brains are.
The more white matter we have in the brains, that helps the dendrites to communicate with the different neurotransmitters, right?
Kind of,
How does white matter compare to gray matter? Because I don't know about either, but I have heard that meditation, for example, increases the gray matter. Is that right?
White matter. The gray matter is the cell bodies, like the bodies of the neuron. And then the white matter is this myelin coating that goes along the axons, and the axons are the part that send the neurotransmitters. And the myelin allows it to travel more efficiently. It's like insulation, Okay. And so we do see that strategies like yoga and mindfulness increase the efficiency of those connections, and to some extent increase white matter too, which is amazing, especially in certain areas of the brain, like the insular cortex. They can show that in research. So that's pretty impressive.
So this may be the obvious question because you've talked about it a couple of times, but I'm assuming that yoga and meditation and exercise are part of your treatment protocol.
Yeah.
That's
it's
awesome.
The easiest way to impact neurotransmitters, and not only the things that we see, but even studies looking at adults with major depressive disorder and more. Exercise is just as effective, if not more effective, than our best medications on the market right now. It's just getting that buy-in, because especially when you're talking about depressed adults, getting them to exercise is a challenge. But that's one of our first recommendations always. Now, in the OT world, we tend to use our OT terms. So we might call them like proprioceptive and vestibular strategies. But at the heart, they're exercise. It's movement, And so those are the kinds of strategies that we recommend. And proprioceptive strategies are mainly weight-bearing activities. And so those differ from other forms of exercise in that we're just thinking about like contracting and elongating the muscles. And that form of sensory input does impact neurotransmitter balance for sure, but it's even more effective when we add in the cardio component to increase respiratory and heart rate. That then we're hitting more neurotransmitters. So our sensory strategies change neurotransmitters, and then the exercise or the cardio component makes it even more impactful on the brain.
See, that's cool, man, Gwen, and that's why I have a belief that fields working together take a special interest in something. But Craig, when I'm in a therapy session with the people, I highlight, of course, exercise is going to affect your mental health, no doubt about it. But you go a little deeper into it and look at all the the direct impacts. And of course, we refer to yoga and meditation, all that kind of stuff. So we get a heck of a lot more commonalities than what we probably realize.
Absolutely. And I've learned a lot because in the self-regulation course, it usually is about half mental health practitioners and half OT, SLP types. And I've learned a lot from you guys, from what you do and what you bring to the table. So it is a good combination.
You guys need to get together, man.
I'm telling you.
Yeah, we've seen, I've seen several articles lately about about exercise being as good or better than drugs for mental health.
Right.
And when Chris and I first started this podcast, I do yoga and meditation myself and breathing techniques, and I didn't know that was cognitive behavioral therapy. So when we talked about it on the show, I was blown away. So now to hear you say that you treat people with exercise and yoga and meditation, it's just fascinating to me.
Right. Yeah. And, I don't know if you guys work primarily with kids or adults. With kids, we have to find ways to make it playful, but it's still the same basic principles to make it happen.
Do you work with adults as well?
I don't. I really just work with kids.
Is it true to say that OT typically gets pigeonholed a little bit into that, unfairly, probably?
Into the sensory piece?
No, into working with kids.
Working with kids? Well, I think I just saw statistics on that. I think like 40% of us do work with kids. Primarily schools are a major employer. Don't quote me on that statistic. I can't remember.
But 60 or many of you work with adults. That's news to me, really.
Many work with adults. And with adults, it is a little bit more what Craig was asking about earlier, like occupation focus, not so much on the maybe their work setting, but just again, when we're looking at work, play, and self-care, we're thinking about how to make them functional in their life roles, which often does include a job. So post-stroke, post-brain injury, we're thinking about how are we going to get these people functional again. So it looks different with adults, but no, there's a good amount of people that work with adults.
Let me give a joke alert here. Joke alert, right, Craig? Ready? Joke alert. So we're not working with adults in OT, so they don't wear bras to work. We've gotten in a different space there, maybe.
Maybe so.
But listen, I'm curious just to highlight that again before we move on, right? Like, so people can hear this teaching method and the power of the buy-in to people working with, I'm going to say us, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. What do you find that, I guess you work particularly with kids, but what do you find that people kind of buy into? How depthy do you try to get with the information that you give to them science-wise with the brain? Like, how far do you go with all that?
Well, the neurotransmitters are fairly easy to understand. The brain structures are a little bit more difficult to understand. I do explain a little bit for sure, when we're looking at kids who have an overactive fight or flight system. We talk about the amygdala and we talk about certain centers of the brain in that regard, but I don't go super in depth with all that. I do have this handy little brain model. I can probably, I guess the listeners can't see anyway, but I pull that out with kids, and show them where the amygdala is. And we talk about centers that support it and that can give it too much strength, things like that. But I spend more time talking about the neurotransmitters lately. Maybe it's just, it makes so much sense to me and I get it. But it's fairly easy to explain. You know, I can quickly hand draw a little axon and a dendrite and show how those messages are sent, and talk about levels of each, and how that impacts the way that we feel and therefore how we behave. And so I first got the idea from one of Diana Henry's books called Tools for Teens, and she goes into a pretty scientific explanation of how some of our sensory strategies make that difference. And the teens got it. You know, I would open up that book and show them the picture, and I thought, I can just draw that if I don't have that with me. And now I would say I start having that conversation probably as young as 10. You know, this little girl I worked with today was a bright 9-year-old, and I had that conversation with her too. With younger kids, I just talk about, I go in more basic terms, like these are things that make our brains feel better. These are things that help us focus. These are strategies that help our bodies stay organized. So I don't necessarily get super scientific younger than 10, but 10 and up can get pretty scientific.
And I'll tell you, I think that, you know, when you start talking about the emotional dynamics and teaching adults, you know, on what goes on with that type of stuff,
Yeah.
First of all, you really don't need to give much depthy information to get new stuff. And
Right.
people are really fascinated. Like I'm actually, like, I've been doing this, I guess you said 95. I think you might have me by 2 years. I don't know. You know, where I say what's interesting. Well, even sometimes, Craig, when we're talking about, you know, doing this show together, one of the things I like about Craig and doing the show with him is he's kind of coming clean, you know, from, like, you know, he's not a mental health professional, you know, and I'll say some things, again, this is for the therapists listening out there, that, I don't know, seem sort of basic about anxiety or what post-traumatic stress disorder are. And I think people need to realize, professional folks need to realize, like, people don't know that. They're not. They don't get it yet, and they really get that buy-in, because it's almost fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's so fascinating, and most people have at least heard of dopamine and serotonin and epinephrine.
Right.
So you can build on that pretty easily. You know, they hear it in regards to a lot of people know the connection between, like, dopamine and drugs, you know, so they know, we get the negative side, and we know that depression has to do with too little serotonin. But what the message that the majority of us are not hearing on the news and mainstream media is how much power we have to change those levels without drugs, you know. So that's the message that people get, because they've already heard the terms. They just don't know about the positive strategies we have to enable change in that regard.
You've heard of norepinephrine, Craig?
Yeah, I've heard of that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, commercials and stuff have all helped us out to kind of get some of those basic things, which is really, really cool that our fields are really kind of starting to grow, where people, you know, they start talking about that and they start becoming aware of that. I mean, did you know that exercise affected your dopamine levels?
I did know that.
You know, right. You know, these things are starting, and it's exciting to me. When the people are knowing a little bit more, you know, about the emotional centers. And, you know, I was listening to Stuff You Should Know, and these guys were talking about, you know, their old friend, the amygdala, right? They're like, it's the fight or flight affects so many things, and they go back to that over and over and over again, and they apply it to different things that people are dealing with in real life. And I think that application to things that people are struggling with, such as, how do I get my kid to eat broccoli? Yeah. It can really help people in day-to-day functioning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think so. Right. Yeah.
So by the way, we did agree with you. We got so our listening audience will know we got a part 2 hopefully coming up. We're gonna get you back, right? Because we ain't gonna cover how. I thought about this when I was doing show prep, Grant. How do we take the 8 hours we spent together and whittle it down into 2, right?
Right. It's kind of hard to do.
Can we please try? You know,
we're making a good dent. We're off to a good start.
So autism and sensory disorders, right? And you know, these types of things. First of all, is kind of an interesting factor, and you allude to it earlier. I'm curious what you've seen, because first of all, are you a researcher?
That's a hard question to answer. You know I do a lot of research to write my webinars, because I want everything I say to be evidence-based. So I research in that regard. I have led 2 research studies. I do not enjoy the process, so I don't think I would really call myself a researcher. But I like researching what's already out there on the web.
That's funny.
The process of the study, I hated the process of writing it up, and
I'm going to be honest with you. I just can't do it. I can't get into it. And I'm so grateful for you who have tried, because I will call you a part researcher then.
Yes.
And thank you very formally for doing that. I was talking to Dr. Weigel on our show, Weigel rather, sorry. Geez. And he corrected me. He's like, I'm not a researcher, Chris. He's like, I'm a research interpreter.
Yeah,
So,
yes. I feel more comfortable in that regard too. I like looking at all that's out there, and that's just so huge for our field, at least right now, is that everything we do needs to be evidence based, and it's tough sometimes because when we're looking at some of the methods that we're using that target so many things simultaneously, it's always hard to know for sure what it is that's working. It's problematic, and that's what makes research tough.
So the reason why I asked that is, it seems like, the frontal cortex with ADD and autism, with the white brain matter in between the two hemispheres and the communication that kind of goes on there. So you've heard, and we used to talk about Asperger's and stuff. So you've heard these things, and they are seemingly becoming a whole lot more common.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a read on what you're reading about or seeing? Is that true? Do we have any theories on kind of why, like what's going on? Are cows eating stuff they're not supposed to eat and it's getting into our food? Like what is going on with all this stuff?
Yeah. Oh, I wish I knew. Lots of theories. I think most people agree that there's something we're doing, there's probably a combination of a genetic predisposition combined with something happening in our environment, something we're eating, something that's going on, to see the incidence of those more obvious disorders, like autism. So I think that's definitely, there's something that's triggering that in more and more individuals, which makes you think it has to be environmental if it's increasing in that incidence. So I don't know. But I think, we are, I think we will know over the next couple of decades, because there is a fair amount of research being done looking at the causes. There are things that we've ruled out already, like the vaccines,
Okay.
So we're getting a little bit closer. But there's still
hit that real quick. Yes, I didn't even know that. So what are some of the things that we did kind of rule out? Like I've never heard that we ruled out the vaccine issue.
Well, the majority of medical doctors feel that the evidence is sufficient to say the vaccines are not the cause. And that was a deeply, strongly held belief by a lot of parents for many, many years. But there's no direct evidence showing that connection at this point in time. So we feel like we basically ruled that out. There are still some people who disagree with that, but the medical community at large feels like that has been ruled out.
Why do you think that's such a hot button topic? I mean, people get ugly about that issue.
I think it's because of when autism emerges, when the symptoms become obvious, are just so close to that 18-month set of vaccines that a lot of parents feel like they see sudden change. Now, in my work as an OT, when I start asking more in-depth questions, I actually feel like usually there are symptoms that are present earlier, but they're easy for parents to miss. In fact, a lot of the parents of kids with autism will say, they were the easiest baby in the world. Actually, it's one of two extremes. They either say they were a really hard baby or they were a really easy baby. And the easy ones, you think, well, maybe they're easy because they're content to sit and watch the fan spin for a long period of time. Things like that, because kids with autism are very visual in what draws their attention. And then the hard ones are usually the ones who are really over-responsive to sensory input. So they'll say, well, they cried a lot. They were really fussy. So I think those are some of the early signs, that are easy for parents to miss, because everybody says, well, lots of babies cry a lot, or, well, you're just blessed, he's an easy baby. And so they tend to overlook some of those early signs and symptoms. And it's when language starts to emerge or fails to emerge, and then that causes frustration. And that's when they start seeing the more obvious symptoms. And so it can seem sudden to parents. And I think that's why parents feel that it has to be connected to something going on. Like vaccines, they were an easy thing to blame because of the timing for a long time. Yeah.
Are there other things in your mind, Gwen, that you can think about that we've kind of ruled out as far as, maybe causal factors of increased awareness or?
I'm just not enough of an expert on that to talk about it. On the flip side, but yet related, there we see kids who are definitely on the spectrum. And then we see this other set of kids who have some signs and symptoms like sensitivities, maybe some global delays, but do not qualify for spectrum disorders. And those are the kids who have this obvious delay in what we're calling self-regulation skills. And I do have some theories on what's causing an increase in self-regulation issues in general. That these self-regulation issues are part of autism, but they're also a part of this other bigger population. And I think to some extent it is, how we are as a society. We see kids growing up with iPads and iPods in hand. There's even a little potty training toilet seat that has a built-in iPad stand.
Oh, Lord.
Wow.
So these kids are growing up with short attention spans, not having to learn a lot of those self-regulation skills that we learned through play, through games. You think about a game like Chutes and Ladders, and it's frustrating to have to go down that chute when you're almost at the top of the game. And so those kinds of games taught us self-regulation that this generation is just largely missing out on. If they play games, they're usually electronic, and when you die, a new little life pops up. So it's not really that frustrating, And so, I have more theories on that subsection of the population and why we're seeing an increase in a lot of those issues. With autism, I don't know. I have any real insight into that yet.
Yeah, we're going to dive into that a little bit. I don't know if it'll be in our, did we say already, Craig? We're going to go part 1 and part 2 and part 3 and part 4, maybe? When? Part 5?
Maybe.
Just have a regular. We'll just make it a 3-person show.
There we go. We'll be shot.
What are the other theories? I mean, I've heard the autism theory with vaccines, but are there other theories about what the cause is?
Preservatives is one theory in the foods that we eat. There are some theories on medications that parents take during pregnancy, but that's not obviously it's not always the cause, because there are plenty of moms who weren't on the meds that are thought to increase the incidence. Genetics is definitely there somewhere. There is a higher incidence among siblings, or higher likelihood in some cases. So lots of theories, but no solid leads yet.
And I honestly wonder, if to a certain extent it really has to do with like our awareness as a society that these things are evident. I mean, the joke is that everybody has ADD, and that's not true. Like, I find it misdiagnosed a lot of times, particularly for kids that have anxiety. We will misdiagnose them and unfortunately treat them with medications when it's really, this is a freaking anxious kid who can't sit still, Right.
Yeah.
So, but the other side of that is we do have more awareness in looking for kids in preschool and 4 years old. I mean, my wife works with the CDSA, Child Development Services Administration, and that's kids 0 to age 3 that are getting identified with this stuff.
Right.
Which is fantastic, because the earlier that we engage, the better we have for outcomes.
Absolutely.
But is it like medical treatment awareness has increased? Possibly?
I think that's part of it. I do, but still, even in my time as an OT, and even looking back to my childhood, I've always had, I guess, a passion for people with disabilities. And so I remember the kids in my grade school who were in the special education classroom and who would come join us for PE and lunch and all of that. And they were kids with obvious disabilities. And I don't remember kids who looked typical like kids with autism do, who were in those classes at that time. And then even as a young therapist and in college, when I did volunteer work before I even became a therapist, what the kids who show autistic behaviors were fewer and far between than they are now, and they are, these kids look typical, but you can easily recognize them if you're around them for more than 5 minutes, by the way that they respond to the environment and behave. And so I do still feel like, although part of it could be more awareness, I think that truly the incidence is increasing rapidly too. It's just a unique subset that I think we would even remember from back in the day, if we were seeing it at the same rate that we are now.
I guess I see your point, because I'm thinking back myself too. And Maybe I'll think about that. Thank you for that, because
Yeah.
that's really true. It wasn't. Yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So do you treat kids with autism differently than you do like the little girl you mentioned in the beginning?
Well, let's go quickly to Gwen then with like, what is autism? We haven't covered that yet. We talked about sensory disorders, but along with Craig's thought there, what is autism and what is ADD?
Sure. Those are big questions. Autism, in a nutshell, impacts social connections and communication most profoundly. And nearly always, we also see sensory processing differences. And the way that those manifest in kids with autism are big reactions to sounds, usually picky eating, usually lack of things that are going on in their body, like hunger and thirst, the need to go to the bathroom, things like that. And then we see some of the things that are a little bit more, that make them stand out a little bit more too, like flapping, jumping, toe walking, twirling. Those kinds of behaviors are rooted in sensory issues as well, like needing more proprioceptive and vestibular input than what they would otherwise be getting. We see many kids with autism do a lot of visual stim, like flicking things in front of their eyes. And that is a way to get out competing stimuli in their environment. So it's the social communication piece and it's the sensory piece. Those are the factors that largely define autism. In many kids with autism, we feel like IQ level is normal, but not able to be demonstrated to their full capabilities because of the limitations in communication and sensory processing to a large extent.
I wonder, Gwen, if I could just jump in. Did we just lose your mic or what happened there? Did we lose Craig?
It does sound like you're a little further away.
How about now?
Yeah, that's good. I think we're okay. Yeah, I think we're okay.
I'll try not to move around as much. So that's autism. I start talking with my hands, and I know that's not helpful on a podcast anyway, but maybe that's and then ADHD, I think, and again, I'm not a diagnostician and I wouldn't say I'm an expert in that, but I think we're kind of seeing a couple things with ADHD. We know that there are forms of ADHD that have to do with differences in the norepinephrine transporter gene, which is ADHD inattentive type, and then a difference in the dopamine transporter gene that is labeled as ADHD hyperactive type. And then there's a combined type that has to do with the difference in the choline transporter gene. So in some kids, I think that ADHD is a genetic issue. However,
real quick, the choline transporter gene, what is that?
That's the combined type. It's, part of like acetylcholine, how it gets from the one axon to the next.
Choline is another neurotransmitter?
Right. It's a class of neurotransmitters. And so those are the three major subtypes of ADHD. And so in some cases, I think it is a true genetic difference like that. But I think also when we look at the signs and symptoms of ADHD, I think we can also be looking at kids whose brains have been affected by chronic stress, toxic stress in the homes, by too many electronics, too little outdoor time. I think that those factors can also change neurochemistry enough that they display signs and symptoms of ADHD. Brains affected by trauma, for sure. If your lower level centers are dominant and you're living in fight or flight, it's difficult to free up those higher level centers that are responsible for the behaviors that prevent us from appearing as though we have ADHD. And so then we also know that oftentimes I think ADHD is one of those things that I definitely think is overdiagnosed, like your joke about everybody having it. And I think a lot of times it's sensory processing disorder can easily get misdiagnosed as ADHD too, because it's not available in the DSM-5. SPD is not. So although a lot of the symptoms look the same, doctors and psychologists are able to diagnose ADHD and not SPD. So they're calling it ADHD when really it might be a sensory processing disorder that has more to do with how they're making sense of their environment.
Absolutely. And again, what's that?
Did I get completely off track there?
No, absolutely. It took me back to referring for OT. I mean, honestly, there are times, well, first of all, I'm curious before I forget too, did you say you're not a diagnostician, so you can't render a diagnosis for like ADD and whatnot?
No, OTs cannot.
Okay. And so when we're seeing, and I'll see that, when I'm diagnosing ADD versus autism or whatnot, or wondering like, does ADD apply here? But I'm not seeing a lot of anxiety kind of things that might be confused with ADD. That is a rule out. And unfortunately, yeah, you're right. It's frustrating to me that we can't just diagnose sensory processing disorder,
Right.
SPD, as you call it, like that. That should be like a thing. Like, why do we have to like pigeonhole someone into ADD because they're freaking out in their classroom because they can't stand their cotton sweatshirt?
Right, exactly. Or the noises of their classmates, or being able to know where their body is in space to stay still. So and we did a group of people lobbied for SPD to be included in the DSM-5, and at the time the decision makers saw that the issues existed, but they felt like the evidence indicated SPD was always part of autism or always part of ADHD.
Yeah.
And not evidence to show it was a standalone diagnosis. And now we have some more research, including brain imaging, that shows differences in brains of people who just have SPD without anything else. So I think it will make it into the DSM-6, but for now, it's not an option for doctors and psychologists.
All right, Miss Wild, let's get political here a little bit for just a second, can we? We're gonna have some fun with this one. So you're right. Now, that's exciting to know that that the sensory processing disorders, SPD, will get maybe some play. And that's awesome. So here's where I'm gonna get political. You ready for this? I got a resentment with these people who made decisions on DSM-5. Okay. What happened, and what is your opinion or view with losing the title of, Craig, have you ever heard of Asperger's?
Yeah.
Yeah, you've heard of it. You know, kind of. You know what it is, or how would you qualify what that is? That's cool to see what you think.
I'm not sure I can define it, but I think I know what it is.
You kind of heard of it.
Yeah.
And okay, so what's your view, man? If we're going to DSM-6, can we get that sucker back?
I kind of miss it too.
Yeah.
Basically, Craig, Asperger's is now being called high functioning autism. And so people with Asperger's tend to have better communication skills. They tend to be the types of kids and adults who basically can be mainstream. They're in general ed classrooms. They're your doctors. They're your lawyers. They're out there in the world. But they appear to be quirky. They have some of those more subtle issues with social skills. They often struggle to read body language and facial expression, so they may not be super successful in relationships. They often don't see the point in social niceties, so they can be very blunt, bordering on rude sometimes. So they struggle with those more subtle issues. And so in the DSM-5, Asperger's was taken away. And now they can label high functioning autism or autism. And we often use the term high functioning autism to describe what we used to have called Asperger's. As far as my feeling on it, I
come on, get mad with me. Let's make it real.
Well,
get angry.
Our first thought, you always wonder about is it a money issue? Our insurance companies not wanting to pay for services for these individuals who are pretty high functioning. And if that's the case, I think it is scary, because those individuals are the ones who fit in enough. Like, I'm thinking of a high schooler I worked with. Great kid. His name is Eric. He was labeled with Asperger's before they took the diagnosis away, so he still identifies as having Asperger's. And he's a kid, that as an adult, I can look at him and think he's cool and quirky and likable. But I can see why the kids think he's weird, And so, and that's how kids see him. He's just weird. And so you feel your heart hurts for those kids, because they're bright. They know they don't fit in, but they're not sure how to go about fitting in. And with a lack of, once he did not qualify for autism. So this kid who used to get services like OT and speech therapy for Asperger's.
I'm getting angrier.
I know. It's harder now to get services for him.
Yeah.
He doesn't have an official diagnosis anymore. And yet he's a kid who is he's at high risk for depression. He definitely has anxiety. because he can't figure out how to fit in. He has fantastic parents who are willing to pay out of pocket if need be, and so he's lucky, but not all kids are. And even to have a parent who identifies it, if we take away a diagnosis like that and the parents are being told he's typical, he's normal, stop worrying about him. But the kids know, they sense they're different.
Yeah.
Sense they can tell that things don't come as easy for them as they do for everybody else. And with Asperger's, we usually see a lot of executive function issues as well, like time management, that impacts their ability to figure out how to get projects done. And so here's this kid, just from what I know about him, I would say his IQ is incredibly high,
Oh yeah.
Too high for his own good, really, but he can't get his homework turned in. He lacks those executive functioning skills that really need a lot of work. And so, we're able to address that in OT using creative therapeutic billing in some cases. But it's a little bit more stretch. We have to figure out, how are we going to qualify this kid, knowing that we no longer have a diagnosis that insurance companies pay for,
Craig, I don't know. She doesn't sound mad enough to me. Does she sound angry?
I don't think she's angry, but I think she's perturbed.
Yeah, perturbed? That's a good word. Will you join me in saying you're perturbed?
Right. Yeah, I would say I'm perturbed. The one benefit, I think, is that if some kids who we used to say had Asperger's now do qualify for autism.
Yeah, mild, particularly mild, yeah.
Yeah, which does open up a lot of things for them. So in some cases, it's kind of beneficial, and then in other cases, they fall through the cracks.
And I tell you real quick, in my travels, I've come across lots of different things, and I really kind of came across I forget who it was, to be honest with you. I'd love to have them on the show. If you can think about who you are, and call in or email me, please. Because they really presented a really cool different perspective on Asperger's that I think therapists will really benefit from when working with this. Because I still, by the way, for the rest of my career, I'm going to still use the word Asperger's. I've determined. I don't know if it gets me in trouble, but I'm going to do it.
Right.
Can't diagnose it, but that's fine.
Yeah.
It is a cool, like she will come across these symptom traits and talk with parents, and she'll come in the room and she'll be real bright. She'll be like, hey, you know what? Guess what? We've really figured out that your child's brain is amazing. It works in a different way. It pulls detailed information about stuff that people typically don't see. People typically don't see the patterns with puzzles, and they don't get the information together. Like, Craig, interesting fact, with somebody that has Asperger's, they won't put puzzles together like you and I will, right? When you correct me if I'm wrong, that we will go around the corners and the edges and get boundaries and put that together first, and then we'll work in from the outside in, and we'll try to get the lines matching up in the order and organization. That is not the way they do it, right, Gwen?
That's true.
How do they put puzzles together? Go ahead. How do they?
Go ahead. You're on a roll.
Yeah, man. It's so fascinating to me. They put puzzles together by looking at like the colors and the patterns and the way things work in the organizational structure of the whole picture. And they'll find two little puzzle pieces together and put it together and match that pattern together. And they don't care about the boundaries.
Right.
It is fascinating. Yeah.
Along those same lines, I listened to a session at our conference, and there were Israelis who, all of their kids, I think this is right, I hope I'm getting enough of the facts right, serve in their military for a couple of years after graduation from high school. And so they're taking the kids with high functioning autism, and they are having them read satellite images to be able to see tiny differences that most of us wouldn't even notice. And
right.
on the spectrum, they zoom in on it right away.
Oh, it's amazing. Yeah.
And it's for military purposes, and so they're really able to harness the strengths of these kids in a unique way.
They function very, very well and provide a great service.
Right.
Interesting.
You thought, Craig? Well, Craig, we're coming up on a hard stop time. Let's transition to part 2. All right.
Okay.
So let's give our listening audience this week a little bit of a teaser. We haven't talked about some of the cool words like cerebellum and configuli and whatever. Configuli is not a real word, just so people know.
I wondered.
Right? I was amazed, and I have already quoted you, ma'am, on our show.
Okay, great.
All right. I've already done it, and it's going to stick with me for a very long time. Craig, that you remember, this is the lady that I told you about on our show that taught me that, get this now, man, it trips me out, right?
I'm excited to hear it.
We have, Craig, 200 different neurotransmitters in our body that we have identified, right? Upon which we have only been able to even name 60 of them, upon which, and one of which I couldn't repeat it began with the C. The one with I'm going to sound stupid because I can't remember the inattentive neurotransmitter ADD type. What is that?
Oh, the inattentive one has to do with the norepinephrine transporter difference.
Oh, well, I misheard you earlier.
The C one is the choline transporter difference. That's the combined type.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Craig, of the 60 that we've named, we only work with like 10 of them. Holy cow.
Right.
That amazed me, ma'am. Can you say a little bit about that? What do we know and what do we not know?
Sure. So neuro researchers feel like we probably have about 200 in all. About 50, maybe 60 have been named. And then for my purposes, we talk about maybe 6 to 8 as far as these being the primary ones that impact behavior and emotions. And luckily, those same 6 to 8 are also the easiest for us to impact through some pretty simple strategies like exercise, deep pressure, sunshine, aroma, some pretty simple things that we can do to balance out these neurotransmitters that play such a huge role in emotions and behavior. So it's exciting, and you can start seeing it in yourself once you become aware. You'll just think about, how do I feel before? And that's what I talk about with kids, before, during, and after. How do I feel before I try this strategy? How do I feel during, and how do I feel after? And the more that you kind of bring that to your conscious awareness, just even little things like, how do I feel when I'm watching a scary movie? And notice the difference in my heart rate, my respiratory rate, and what's going on in my brain, and how alert I am. And so
maybe melatonin, and paying attention to how that's affected.
So what you guys are saying is there's 200 identified, 60 named, and 10 that we know about.
That we manipulate.
Okay. Interesting.
That we can
Yeah, and based on what you just said about sunlight and exercise and aroma, and that's I can't wait for part 2.
Yeah,
it's fascinating, man. And I'll tell you, I want to warm them up, Gwen, with that. That's what stunned me. But it'll be a fun thing for our audience. It just occurred to me as I was listening to you that they can go and they can do. All right. Okay. So our listening audience can go to. Oh man, I can't even read my own handwriting. My gosh. What is it? Bereavemandtest.com. Oh,
yeah, it's a cool tool. It's called
Tell us about it.
It's called the Braverman Personality Test, and it's bravermantest.com, essentially, is the website.
You spell it?
Brave, like be brave, B-R-A-V-E, so it's B-R-A-V-E-R-M-A-N, and then personality test. And it's just an online tool that Dr. Braverman created that you go through and you answer these questions, things like, I concentrate effectively. I do better with caffeine. People say that I am goal driven, just lots of things like that. And you just click true or false right on the screen. And then it totals up for you the main neurotransmitters that we'll talk about next week, in fact, to help define which ones are dominant in your brain and which ones are deficient. Now, Dr. Braverman himself is a little bit controversial, but this tool does seem to be based in evidence, and it seems to correlate with the research I've done. So I feel pretty good about recommending it. Just taking it for what it is. It's just an online assessment. We can't make definite decisions. We don't know for sure, but there's signs and symptoms of neurotransmitter differences that gives you some pretty good insight. And so after it defines your dominant neurotransmitters and your deficiencies, he gives you like a little paragraph explaining how that might manifest in your life, how it might impact your career, your mood, and even goes so far as to recommend supplements that could help with balancing the neurotransmitters. So we can talk more about that next week too, but pretty cool.
I can't wait. Yeah. So before you go, we're up on 7:30. Do you have social media, your own website you want to tell listeners to?
I sure do. Thank you. My website is sensationalbrain.com. And then on social media, we are Sensational Brain on Facebook, Instagram, and Pinterest. And then it's Sensation Brain on Twitter, just because of the limited characters available there. But the others are Sensational Brain.
Okay, cool.
It is a sensational program. It's an awesome conversation. I'm really looking forward to getting into what we get into next week with some of the, probably a little bit more of the science and crazy words, Craig, that I don't know we've ever heard before.
Well, I'm interested in the sunlight and the aromas and the movement.
Yeah.
It's going to be good.
Yeah.
When,
And if you've experimented with different forms of exercise, and you kind of already know that you feel differently after different forms. So we'll talk about how to know which kind will be best for you and other strategies that you can use too. So it is fun. It's a fun topic.
so do we all want to share our Braverman test results at braverman.com? What is it?
Let's do that Monday.
We'll do that?
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Sounds good. Gwen, thank you so much for your time. I'm looking forward to another chat.
Thank you, Chris and Craig. It was fun talking to you.
Thank you, Gwen. See you soon.
Okay. Bye-bye.
So that was, I think, what we call it, Craig, for episode 46, Neurology of the Brain and Effects in Our Life with Gwen Wild, part 1. That was pre-recorded. We're doing the extra recording now, right?
Yeah.
That was
that
fun.
was good. Yeah, and I'm really excited about part 2.
Yeah, I tell you what, I'm really looking forward to that as well, because we'll get into a little bit more of the actual neurotransmitter process and kind of how it is impacted by screens. She mentioned a little bit, and I can't wait to ask her about diet.
Yeah,
dietary concerns.
See, a lot of the stuff that she's talking about is stuff I'm really interested in.
Yeah,
like movement and she said aromas. So I'm not where she's going to go with that.
I can't wait to get
essential
nutrition.
oils, or I don't know what she's going to do, but I'm interested to hear what she has to say about the next thing.
Yeah, it's going to be awesome. Why don't you take us out of here? I'll tell you where we're going next after the next, because the next is going to be part 2, right?
Yeah. Through a Therapist's Eyes, folks. We're up on 45 shows now, I think, and we have individual entries for each show on our website, throughatherapisteyes.com. We've got show notes. You can listen right there on the website. You can find us on just about any podcast platform. We've got a YouTube channel now. And we're trying to get the word out as best we can. You can also find links to our Facebook and Instagram and the YouTube channel, too, on the website. And tell your friends, folks. We want to spread the word about mental health and mental health issues, emotional issues. And word of mouth is still the best way to do it, man. So let your friends know.
Share an episode. One episode you could share on the ... thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also, too, sign up for our email list. Subscribe and give us a 5-star review, please.
All those things, man. I'm going to tell you, hit the donation button, too. We've been starting to talk about that. Where are we going next? Man, we're going to hit... I figured it was perfect. I was actually sitting in a session just the other day, and somebody was talking, and I was like, oh, man, you know what? I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that for you. And it was all about ADD, Attention Deficit Disorder.
Okay.
Yeah. And it fits...
Well, all for me. You think I got an ADD?
No, man. Did you see that bird that flew over there?
Huh?
Yeah.
No.
Anyway, ADD, man. We're gonna hit that next.
We having a guest, or you're the expert?
Well, we are. We're just gonna talk me. Some thoughts that I have about childhood ADD and how it affects or morphs into adult ADD. And there's some different things that I've seen in clinical practice with people over years. Because we used to think that ADD burnt out as a kid. It's only a kid issue, but that's not true. It has a lot more going on in adulthood. And we're going to kick that around. We also got some group discussions as well, that I'm still working on. It's 2 or 3 of them. I think I've mentioned them. Dog training or having a service dog. That's going to be fun soon too.
Yeah, I want to see how that one fits into the mental health picture.
Absolutely, man. Thanks for having with us this guy. Guys. Jeez, what is that?
Thanks for hanging with us, guys.
Thanks for hanging with us, Craig. See you next week.